Hi everyone, you're listening to the Southasia Review of Books podcast from Himal Southasian, where we speak to celebrated authors and emerging literary voices from across South Asia. I'm your host, Shwetha Srikanthan, coming to you from Colombo, and my guest today is the acclaimed historian Manan Ahmed Asif, joining us from New York to talk about his new book, Disrupted City, Walking the Pathways of Memory and History in Lahore. Before we get started, I'd like to invite our listeners to check out Himal's Patron program on our website, where you can pay to support our mission to give South Asian literature the spotlight it deserves. To make conversations like this possible, we need the support of our listeners like you. In Disrupted City, Manan parses Lahore's centuries-old literary, social, and cultural history, and the ways in which these resonate today. From the role of memory and violence, as well as the city's people, the survival, and questions of nationalism, Manan explores the impact of imperial and state power, dislocation, and erasure on this South Asian city. Inviting readers to walk with him across Lahore, Manan evokes a rich cast of figures and contemplates how the city has been made and unmade over the years, while challenging the narratives and erasures of the Pakistani nation-state and its larger project of rewriting history. Manan, welcome to the South Asia Review of Books podcast, and thank you so much for joining us to talk about this fantastic new book.
Thank you so much, Shwetha, for inviting me, and thank you to Himal South Asia for this platform. I'm a huge fan. I've been a reader for many decades, so really glad to be here.
Really glad to hear that, Manan. Let's start with how this book began in another book. In early 2009, when you were browsing for books in the streets of Lahore, you stumbled across a volume of Ahmad Chishti Lahori's writing. And this led you to many walks across the city as you began thinking through the cultural and historical connections that make up the city. So, how has your relationship to Lahore changed over the years, and how did the book come to be?
As I narrate in the book, the kind of finding of this popular, on a street corner, this history from the late 19th century helped me see how to think about the city. But the reason I was interested in thinking about the city, about Lahore in particular, is a story sort of a year and a half before that encounter. And that's when I was born in Lahore. I lived away from it my adult life, but my family's there. I visit and do research there. But in 2000 and 2007 and 2008, there were a series of suicide bombings that happened in Lahore. And these bombings targeted both kind of quote unquote, state apparatus, but also cultural and sacred sites. And in my own lived experience of Lahore, those bombings really change the landscape and the infrastructure that is visible if you're in Lahore. So, everything from barbed wires to cement and concrete corridors to new surveillance technologies to military officials visibly present in all kinds of spaces, schools, mosques, shrines, courtyards. And so my own personal experience of going to a bombed out movie theater that I used to visit when I was younger and seeing the devastation that the suicide bomb had done forced me to think about what does it mean for a city as old as Lahore to undergo such rapid transformation within a year of these cataclysmic events. And that got me thinking about what does it mean for continuity and change when we're thinking about places that have been inhabited for hundreds and thousands of years, going through invasions, floods, fires, political upheaval, famines. What allows for a city to persevere, but also what happens to the city as a result of these types of transformations. And I didn't really know how to do that when I started thinking about it. And the discovery of this book, Tahqiqat-e-Chishti, as you mentioned, on a street corner, and basically these are books that would be pulped or be thrown away, but people kind of scavenge them and sell them on footpaths, pavements. The discovery of this book actually opened up. The book opens with a kind of description by the author about previous devastations that Lahore has undergone. And I started to think about this idea of disruption, devastation. And so that book opened up a way for me to think about the past in a very particular form, which is, I don't want to say resilient. So it's not the city that reemerges from a disaster is not necessarily the same city that existed before it, but it is something about its capacity to be reborn again that I was interested in tracing. And then, of course, as I argue in the book, that the 1947 partition of the subcontinent is a type of disruption that had radical change, sort of radical kind of consequences for the city of Lahore.
In the book, you share an incident where you were escorted at gunpoint out of a residential colony because you had accidentally walked in the street behind an important politician's house. Just this example shows that Lahore is not really a walking city, even for an able-bodied male figure like yourself, whether that's due to class, infrastructure, gender, or even caste barriers. Tell us more about the choice you've made in structuring the book around city walking and the experience of moving through the city.
I mean, as you know, as you and your listeners and viewers would be familiar, there's a figure that sort of exists or looms large in the Western imagination, which is the figure of the flaneur, which is a figure that generally emerges from places like Vienna and Paris and Berlin at the turn of the last century, and that male able-bodied figure, in its earliest instances with someone like Walzer, etc., is poor presenting, as in, maybe may not have the kind of, their family may be rich, but they themselves may not be. But then sort of Proustian, Benjamin-esque versions of this will get more and more class solidification. And so to narrate the city through the perspective of the flaneur is, of course, both a literary convention and a sociological, analytical one. But the thing is that the opposite of the other side of the flaneur, the streetwalker, is rendered as a deviant person, as a prostitute. So if a woman walks, she's called a streetwalker. And that streetwalker has specific moral, reprobative, social concerns attached to it. And then when we come to South Asia, the capacity to inhabit a public street, to walk in a public street, is incredibly restrained by one's caste. As we know, across South Asia, the capacity of people of lower caste to be visible in the street, to occupy the same street as the upper caste peoples, to walk, are restricted by various kinds of a program. And this goes back to historical time, as in in my first book, I talk about what's mentioned in the Persian histories as an outcast tribe, what we would call a Dalit community, that is asked to always walk with an impure animal, a dog or a pig next to them, so they are visibly available. They can be visibly seen from afar as outcasts. So these histories inform the type of kind of gendered caste and class dimensions to walking in the South Asian city. And I wanted to be really conscious of those privileges, those restrictions. And what I also mentioned in the book is that, and I say this, I think, straight out, that Lahore is not a walking city. You actually physically, even if you're able-bodied, there is a lack of infrastructure for walking, lack of pavements or footpaths that run parallel to residential or commercial streets. The various colonies that exist, residential colonies as we call them, are gated. People have both private and state restrictions on access to different places. And of course, the kind of the infrastructure of your urban life is not. I mean, I walk in New York all the time, which has incredibly wide footpaths or pavements, so you can walk at a high rate, as you can walk really fast. You can walk on a flat surface, and so these questions of what it means to walk in the city are meant in my analytical understanding of Lahore to foreground the questions of power. So people who have capacity to inhabit the city inhabit it via different modes of transportation. So those who walk are those who cannot afford to take the bus, or those who cannot afford to take a rickshaw, or those who do not own a motorcycle, or those who don't have a domestic car or a foreign car, and so on and so forth. So what that meant is that, as I say, that even as an able-bodied, bearded, well-dressed man in the city, I would get stares, and people would come up to me and ask me, what are you doing? And I said, I'm just walking. They said, what do you mean you're just walking? Like, someone who looks like me in terms of what clothes I'm wearing should be in a car, or should be on a motorcycle, or should be with other people. So why are you alone? Why would you walk alone? So those types of things. I mean, the incident with the gunpoint is obviously a kind of a unique example, but those types of encounters were almost daily. I would be just walking by a bazaar, and but I'm not looking to buy something. So people are like, what are you doing? Why are you loitering? What is happening with you? And so that really puts us into question with, like, how do we understand the urban space? When the urban spaces do not conform to our idea of the public as formed through the public space in the Western city. It also does not conform to the issues of labor and gender as we may understand in other contexts, non-South Asian contexts. And what that I mean is that, a woman is imagined in the public sphere. So it's not that they're not imaginable in the public sphere, but they're imagined in a very, very particular role. They can be with other women. They can be with a male, figure. They can be in a specific types of modes of transportation based on their clothing and class status, etc., etc. And if they are alone, they are prone to all kinds of harassment or all kinds of approbation. And so the urban life of the city is incredibly mediated by all of these vectors. And I wanted the reader of my book to really understand that. I didn't want to disappear I didn't want my walking perspective to be an invisible one, that, I'm kind of just floating around. And I wanted that friction of the incapacity to walk, the inability to go into spaces, which is, like, as I said, if you're gendered woman or queer or any other form of difference, you cannot have the same ability that even I do. And so I wanted that friction to be very visible on the page.
And Manan, just going off that, you also write about how Lahore is unkind in different ways. This includes hatred, misogyny, and violence against women, the poor, non-Muslims, and other minority communities. You bring up the example of sanitation workers and cleaners who are usually Christian and non-Muslim. They live in temporary and unsecure housing without utilities or access to social and welfare facilities or any other protections, really. By design, the city excludes them and other minority communities from middle and upper classes. Tell us about the different ways in which the city is segregated, and also about the erasure of these communities from the everyday lives of the city.
when we imagine a South Asian city, so I'll just stick to kind of a frame of reference. There isn't the clean division between the kind of business district and the residential quarters and the industrial, and those kind of zoning questions that we're very familiar with in certain other contexts. So what that basically means is that those who have and those who haven't are proximal to each other in the life of the South Asian city, and that proximity, instead of giving us a shared imagination, actually drives segregated kind of mental ideas of the city. And those, in the case of Lahore, what I focus on is this the Christian community, or the Muslim community that is engaged in menial or manual labor, even though they live interspersed next to really highly valued property, and even though they physically perform tasks inside homes, on the streets, around the city, they are invisible to the gaze of the urban planner. They're invisible to the gaze of the state. They're invisible to the production and giving the city's inhabitants clean water, sewage, all of those kind of amenities that one imagines. And this type of this forced invisibility goes hand in hand with violence, with extreme violence. So if there is a so-called case of blasphemy against an individual, entire neighborhoods are burned to the ground. The exclusion goes from places of worship to places of burial, to any public ritual that any of these communities may want to do as part of their belief system. And so I think these things, there's an idea, of a liberal idea, that the city such as Lahore, which is 1,000 years old, has, used to be, at the turn of the 20th century, the highest per capita, according to I can figure out, ratio of colleges, universities, printing presses, and students to any other city in South Asia, right? So a city of extreme learning, or dedicated to learning. And so a city like this has an idea of its own self, as a city of knowledge. And then we see that within that same infrastructure are these communities of people who are just as Lahori as I am, just as Lahori as anyone else is, but who are absolutely absent from the public sphere in a meaningful way, as in they're not physically absent in the public sphere, but they are conceptually absent from the public sphere, and who have the city and the state have absolutely no claims to. They do not give them this type of amenities that the other citizens do. So the unequalness, the segregated nature of Lahore is something that I think is very important for us to understand, even if we are trying to talk about a longue durée life of the city, because this inequality leads us to thinking about who gets to be seen, who gets to be read, who gets to be privileged in the public imagination.
There's also another side of Lahore, what you imagine to be the true spirit of the city, that of Lahore made up of everyday resistance and dissent, and as a site of protest against violence and oppression. Lahore even has a rich history of leftist and feminist movements. It's a city of so many South Asian thinkers, poets, and revolutionaries. Tell us about how your experience of growing up, reading, and thinking in this version of the city has shaped your work.
So this is the kind of, I think, the type of categorical differences that I wanted to think through. That at the same time that a city is embedded in infrastructures of segregation and infrastructures of estrangement from its own citizens, it's a city that has some of the most prominent voices for equality, for community, all the way from Bhagat Singh in the turn of the century to Faz and other luminaries. And so I wanted to understand that how does this city give rise to a critical feminist or Marxist or leftist progressive perspective at the same time as it continues to emerge as a site of state control or a site of conservative worldviews. And I think the key was, of course, that these leftist, Marxist, feminists are in full awareness of the segregations of the city. So they're constantly writing about the working class. They're constantly saying that the women deserve the same type of equitable relationship to the law or to the workplace or to the family that any other person does. And that history, which I try to trace in the book, all the way to the 9th century, this history of equipoise, this history of cohabitation that takes for granted the humanity of the other, of no matter what gender or sex they are. I think that history, I don't want to say is less visible, but it certainly doesn't have the salience in current contemporary imagination. And part of this is the series of dictatorships that Pakistan goes through, which kind of reframes their relationship of power and military to the city and citizen. And part of it is, of course, this kind of patriarchal systems that are really embedded across a lot of domains and dominions. And so I write in the book about how I, as a young person, I go to a particular place in order to play a game of cricket, and as I'm sitting there, someone else tells me that the very site that we are sitting on used to be a colonial jail, and not only a colonial jail, but was the very place where Bhagat Singh himself was imprisoned prior to his hanging by the British colonial government. And I use in the book, I reflect on this change of the landscape, which erases the memory of a revolutionary figure like Bhagat Singh from the daily infrastructure of the city. And for someone like me, I was 16 years old at the time. For someone like me, a 16-year-old in the city, to not have a direct relationship to these earlier critiques of imperialism, of colonialism, of patriarchy, of conservative thought is a huge loss, because I do not have a ways and means of having a feminist politics or having a progressive politics. And so it was very important for me to kind of not just talk about Lahore as a city that is inhabited by a certain amount of political control, segregation, et cetera, but also that there is a long history of critique of power, of the will to truth, of equality. And feminist leaders, those ones that I personally knew when I was young, and I continue to admire and respect them, who went on the street to protest al-Haq's military dictatorship, or who went on the street to protest General Musharraf's military dictatorship, or who continue to do that work even now today. There was an Aurat March, women's march that just happened on the 12th of February in Lahore, and Nigat Khan, who led the march in a wheelchair, was someone who was there from 1981, leading these marches. So that, to me, is also just as important a picture of Lahore as the military barbed wires that I mentioned.
So, Manan, I wanted to talk about the literature that shaped how you view the city and also your own writing. You write about how Sarah Solery's Meatless Days helped you see the forgetting and remembering that constituted her own experience of the city, and by extension yours. Khurshid Kamal Aziz's books provided a corrective to Pakistan's top-down nationalist historiography. You also turned to Kuratalayan Haidar's River of Fire for her vision of the subcontinent's past, and also found parallels of this in various memoirs of Lahore. So, what are some of the other texts featuring the city that stand out to you, or ones you'd recommend for further reading?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think part of what I've tried to do in the book is to think about how to write the subcontinental or the post-colonized city. And what that means is that I think, very frankly, there's two types of dimension. One is that colonialism itself has a kind of overwhelming presence in the narration of the city. And here I don't just mean like things we writing the city is not just kind of typing words or inscription. Writing the city is the built environment of the city. So if you go to Lahore, there's a cantonment area. There are colonial, infrastructure like the General Post Office or the High Court, Supreme Court, etc. So that's the colonial writing of the city, which is on literally the landscape of the city has been transformed by colonialism. And then the kind of corollary to is of course how the colonial authors, travelers, officials inscribed the city, how they wrote about the city. So both types of inscriptions, the inscription in the material landscape of the city and the inscriptions about the city in text, etc., are the heritage, as it would be, of someone trying to write Calcutta or Bombay or Colombo or anywhere else. And so I think when I was looking for how to think about inscribing a city against these or in relationship to these, the authors that I gravitated to were people within the subcontinental context, were people who are really thinking specifically and markedly through questions of memory and history. And so people like Kuratala and Heather, Sarah Soleri, women, feminists, who are writing against both patriarchal norms, but also against the nation state, and are trying to think through what it means to hold a subject position that is ulterior to the one that is the dominant narrative. And those subject positions, I'm thinking of Namdeo Dasal, who's a Dalit poet in Mumbai, whose poetry is just visceral and just tears you apart, like from within, when you read it. And its power comes from that subject position, that being outside of that what is understood by the city, the state, the community to be representative of it. And so I think the greatest inspiration to me are precisely feminist, queer, and Dalit writers of the city or writers of the nation state, because that subject position is what I've tried to think through in my own work. Which is not to say that there aren't beautiful things that people who are writing about the city don't exist, but I think as a writer or as an intellectual, my task is to make sure that the critique that the critical thinking that I can avow is based on a perspective that is separated from my own self. As in, I cannot take my own lower middle class male body, to be representative of an alterity, no matter what, because I share in the privileges that the nation state and patriarchy bestows upon me, and my faith bestows upon me as a someone who grew up in a Sunni household in a majority Sunni nation. So, to me, the books, the texts, the memoirs that I've gravitated to have been those, like I said, that take an ulterior position vis-a-vis the family, vis-a-vis the state, vis-a-vis the city. Yeah, I mean, and I mentioned some of them, and you mentioned them, but yeah, that's that kind of work that I'm really keen to learn from.
You write that Lahore is a city that is partitioned not only from its past, but from those who had built it and lived in it. The nation state in Pakistan acted much like the colonial state in creating its own version of history and streamlining the linguistic, religious, and ethnic differences into an officially sanctioned one. This also includes writing aspects of the city's Hindu and Sikh past out of its history. And the state also put the ways of rethinking colonial and pre-colonial pasts, whether that's archives, history departments, access to languages, out of reach for its people. Even as you've mentioned in the book, repositories of public memory have eroded under various military regimes. Tell us about the challenges you faced in finding Lahore in the archive, writing across all these divides and undoing the colonial and colonizing ways of seeing Lahore's past.
I mean, I'm not going to pretend or claim that I'm able to undo any of these erasures, precisely because these erasures are at a scale that lie beyond any singular perspective. So as a if the first generation post-partition, so people, let's say between 1947 and 1961, if that first generation of Pakistani intellectuals, cultural elite, and state create a Urdu-speaking Sunni understanding of the nation state and of the city, from which its own citizens, like the Bengali-speaking citizens of East Pakistan, or the Shia citizens of Pakistan, or the Ahmadis of Pakistan, are systematically left out or systematically marginalized out of the corridors of power, corridors of understanding of who gets to belong, then I don't think an individual author is able to do much. And I talk about individual historians and poets and who kept through the years trying to speak against these military dictatorships and erasures, on and on and on. But I think what I wanted to do in the book is to not present any of this as a fait accompli, but also not to grant it any kind of organic naturalness. In other words, I think it's important that whether you are a Pakistani or you're not, or you lived elsewhere and are just reading the book for curiosity's sake, I wanted the reader to understand both that the imposition of a majoritarian self was a project, conscious project, that required how to write a textbook, which public holidays should one have, what's the national anthem, what language the national anthem needs to be in, what does these rituals that the state does, what do they look like? So I want the reader to understand that these are all political projects that have to be implemented, and they're not natural. They're not just kind of organic parts of the life of one's citizen. There are set of political decisions and political actions. Because understanding that is the first thing. Because now you're like, oh, okay, this is constructed. So if something is constructed, then that construction has undone something else, has deconstructed something else in order to construct itself. So what is it got deconstructed? I wanted the reader to understand that. And then the third part is those who did not agree to this construction. What were they saying, and how were they marginalized or erased or obfuscated? So with that perspective, I think the archive that as your example earlier in our conversation of finding a book on a city street, illuminates that the archive is a construction, as in I assembled from literary sources, memoirs, correspondences, histories that are written across a long period of time, poetry, oral interviews, infrastructure, physical infrastructure. I constructed a particular archive in order to write this history of dissent, history of the construction of the kind of majoritarian male majority. There's no reason to pretend that it's not. The signification is in masculine, a warrior that's going to defend Islam, who's going to fight communism, and that inhabitation, that personification, is something that how is it brought in? So I do in the book readings of these incredibly popular novels, Urdu novels that are I was told to read, and I read them as a young adult, in which this persona of the Muslim fighters developed over decades. And who is the one who's doing? Well, these are journalists. And who are these journalists? Well, these are journalists who are working closely with the military. Well, why is the military commissioning historical romances or accounts of adventures? Well, the military is also invested in creating a type of citizen, not just a army personnel, but a civilian that is going to really go hand in hand with the military's imagination of itself as a castle or a fort of Islam. And what that means practically, this idea of a castle of Islam or a fort of Islam, is that you imagine yourself to be surrounded by chaos and enemies. And so it's an inward looking kind of project, political project. So it's reactionary, it's conservative, precisely because it imagines itself at odds with that which surrounds it. And so for Pakistan, of course, its partition partner, the twin India, is the threat, right? It's the kind of existential kind of thing that hovers in its imagination. And of course, since 1979, Afghanistan and the war in the Russian war, and then later on the US war on terror in Afghanistan, is going to create another front on the other end. So you imagine from the late 70s onwards to being besieged, and that imagination of besiegement then requires all these types of production, right? So everything from daily newspapers to novels to daily plays to public ritual. And so if that worldview is scattered around all these different archives, then the other view has to be reconstructed from margins of that national project. And I think archives are an incredibly important part, because as a post-colonial state, the British are also going to extract what historians call archive, out of South Asia, out of the subcontinent, to Paris or Leiden or London, etc. And so there's evacuation of two things. There's an evacuation of the nation state, saying we're not going to have a national archive, or if we have a national archive, it's not going to talk about any of this stuff. And that any pre-colonial past is also evacuated from the post-colonial nation, because it now rests in the earlier metropoles. And so a historian is, what my first book, which was on the 13th century Sindh, the archives for that book were not in Sindh, Pakistan. The archives for that book were in London and in Berlin and in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So it's, that's the kind of, the archives are both a presence and a type of epistemic problem that the historian has to figure out, the post-colonial historian has to figure out, which is unlike any other state, right? So if I was a historian of Italy, even if I was a historian of medieval, quote unquote Renaissance, where do I go? I just go to Italy. I just go to Rome. I just go to Venice or Milan. The Renaissance is around me. The archives are right there. The nation state, even if I'm like, oh yeah, fascist came at some point, but I want to talk about pre-fascism. Yeah, it's right there. Any church, any corridor has the capacity for me as a historian to think about Italy's past. That is not the case if I want to think about Sri Lankan past, or I want to think about Pakistani past, or I want to think about Indian past. I cannot do that. I cannot go to that physical place and say, where are the physical worlds that constituted this place 500 years ago? Where is the textual world that constituted this place 500 years ago? It's not there. It's elsewhere. And when you go elsewhere, it's not organized by the world that it was embedded in, right? So a murti is going to become a sculpture by the time it lands in the Met, right? It's no longer, it has been wrenched out of its sacral, its cultural, its emic worlds, and converted into something else, converted into an objet or a artifact. And that goes same for textual production, from epigraphs, all kinds of things. So that violence in the archive, I think, is a fundamental issue. And then in case of Pakistan, there are these other kind of layers of archival erasures that are part of the national project to constitute an Urdu-speaking, Sunni, male, militarily sort of aligned nation state. And I think that my book, I'm trying to wrestle with both of these different types of erasures and different types of archive writing.
Manan, you also talk about the burden of generational migration. You yourself are a migrant, so was your father and his parents. Your mother's parents were also refugees to Lahore. Lahore became a city of refugees and migrants in 1947, and it's never quite stopped being that. You also write about how one of the effects of this is that migrants are forced to put down shallow roots and often choose not to remember or share much in the process. Just like Lahore's past, your family's past was also not easily accessible across these different migratory links. You write about how your grandfather passed away long ago and you never got the chance to ask him any questions. Tell us about the many migrations that have shaped the city, and if given the opportunity to walk with your grandfather across Lahore, what might you ask him?
So I think to the first part of your question, I think there's a way to think about migration that's the post World War, the Second World War idea, which is that migration is a one-way street. One uproots, and then, as I say in the book, one puts down shallow roots and maybe remigrates and then re-remigrates. So, for example, many people who left Lahore went first to Delhi or Bombay, and then they either went further south, so oftentimes to Bangalore, or they went to the UK, or they came to the United States. So, in other words, I have met many people and interviewed them in the United States who are themselves actual migrants from Lahore, but have had like 3 or 4 stops in their life's journey before I met them in Long Island, or I met them in Berkeley, etc. And in a way, their lives at this whatever point they are in, their grandparents, grandchildren, or children have no connection to this journey that they have made. So they understand that my parents were born. I mean, I get this a lot. It's like, oh, my my family's home is in Lahore. But they don't have any idea of what that is in Lahore's fabric, as in what neighborhood, what it looked like, etc. But they also don't have any way of getting to it, as in they can't find their way back to that street address either because of these shallow roots, as I say. This is not what migration looked like for thousands of years. Movement is actually part of the fabric of South Asian life. People moved all of the time. Not to put too fine a point to it about it, but even if you look at something like the Ramayana, it's about movement. It's about constantly moving and then returning, right? So movement and return. Look about Guru Nanak, movement and return. It's cyclical. It moves. Movement is part of it. No one is mad at movement. People love to move. People love to see all of the world that is available to them. You know, we have so many sacral figures in South Asia who fly around the world, you know, on a tiger or on a wall or in transcorporeal movement. So it's not that the people of South Asia don't understand what movement looks like, or they're just really wedded to their place of origin and have never moved, and suddenly migration happens in 47. No, it's the opposite. They can never return. It's the return thing that breaks this long history of movement. And that is the trauma. The trauma is not the migration. The trauma is the lack of return, the return journeys. My maternal grandmother, who was a refugee from Srinagar, from Kashmir, and this is a story that people who went through Nakba in Palestine can tell you others will tell you, she had her keys to her house in Srinagar her whole life. She never let go of those keys. They were always on her. Why? Because she never let go of the idea that her return was a possibility for her. I will go and this key will fit in a lock that I put on that door. And I think it's that trauma of lack of return. So all of our understanding of migration is like this idea that we are wrenched from a place and live in abeyance of that place. But that's not actually the issue. Even for contemporary periods, if you look at economic migrations in Sri Lanka, in South Asia, it's cyclical. So people go to the Gulf, they come back, they go again, so you have a 2-year or 3-year or 5-year or 7 years. This idea that begins in the late 60s, 70s of kind of non-resident Indians or people who are kind of moving in mass to, becoming citizens in another place is also kind of odd, because these migrants, these so-called non-residents, are continue to be incredibly kind of connected to India, as in they go back and they come and, their children go back. And so Kamala Harris or Vivek Raman, all of these figures in United States politics of Indian descent, they all are visible to us as Americans in this context, but they all have the right to return. Even if they are U.S. citizens, even if they're born here, they have a organic relationship to where their parents or their grandparents are from. So who does not have that right to return are the people who were partitioned, right? So that's a singular trauma about migration, that those who were partitioned can no longer return to India or to Lahore, to Bangladesh. And so I think the what I tried to do in the book was trying to think through this tension between the cyclical migration, cyclical movement, and this cessation of movement, this particular cessation. To the second part of your question, as I write, my grandfather was incredibly uncomfortable. My paternal grandfather was a farmer and came from a long line of farmers. And so he was very uncomfortable in the city. And my mother is a city-born girl, and so she was always herself uncomfortable with someone like my grandfather, who was her father-in-law. Yeah, I mean, if I could walk with him, I guess the question I have for him is about soil. I mean, he was a farmer. I live in a concrete jungle. I work with books, but I yearn to know about soil. What was his relationship to not land as a legal concept, but soil that nurtures, an earth that grows? And what does it mean to grow things? I have no idea. But yeah, that's what I would ask him.
Thank you for sharing that, Manan. Lahore has seen destruction many times before, whether, like as you've mentioned, through violence, invading armies, floods, or plagues. And you note how each return of Lahore created a new version of the city. In writing this book, you've also come to realize the climate disaster facing Lahore's immediate future. The city is already experiencing severe fog, unbearable heat, humidity, floods, contaminated groundwater, and a lack of clean air, just to name a few. So a city that has existed for thousands of years might be completely unlivable in the next few decades. How did you grapple with writing a long history of Lahore, knowing there are these ongoing and impending disasters?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think this is the kind of the most important, in a way, for a historian like myself. I was trained in the 9th, 10th century Common Era, and I would read historians writing in the 12th century, 13th century, 15th century, 16th century, and when they wrote their books, their texts, they always imagined a reader in the future. They were able to say that, someone after me is going to come and correct my mistakes. Or they imagine that the place that they're writing about is a place that's going to exist far into the future. And so there's an idea of futurity that I accustomed to thinking about in the archives that I work in, the people like myself who lived 5, 6, 7, 800 years ago, like myself in the sense of my profession as a historian. I don't have that idea of a futurity. I think most projection is that about 300 million people are going to be migrants, climate migrants, anywhere from 15 to 25 years, in between sort of Lahore and Bihar and the coastal Western India and Bengal, coastal Eastern India. So those 300 million people are going to face a lack of air in terms of oxygen due to smog, all of the kind of what we call the winter months, the lack of monsoon, so the stopping of the monsoon, of the pattern, the restriction of the pattern of monsoon, means that they will also start have dwindling water supplies. And then finally, the heat index is going to rise. So in 12 months of the year, there may just be 1 or 2 months worth, so 60 days out of 365 days, where one can breathe or drink or be outside. And this is not some unimaginable future. This is just 15 or 20 years in the future from where we sit. So, in other words, if Lahore has been destroyed many times through various kinds of calamities, but has been able to reconstitute itself by a river, that river is dried up and gone. That river no longer flows. Ravi no longer flows. So this devastation, this forced migration, this forced movement of people because they cannot breathe or cannot drink, there is no coming back from it. And our political and our environmental infrastructure has absolutely nothing, no solution to offer for it. Yeah. So because it's not a solution that just India or just Pakistan can implement. Like, this is a collective South Asia issue. And that means that in a landscape of politics where there is a kind of majoritarianism within each nation state that looks to itself, any idea of cooperation on a common issue, on a common threat, is unheard of, is impossible to imagine. So one can imagine a war between India and Pakistan over water rights. I mean, I can easily imagine that happening in the next few years, as the Himalayan glaciers kind of dwindle, the water distribution spikes between the two countries, the nation states. I can easily imagine a war on water. But I cannot imagine a treaty on air, or I cannot imagine a collective issue on lowering carbon emissions. I cannot imagine a movement from fossil fuels to other forms of production of energy. I cannot imagine them, not because they are not imaginable, but because the politics is not available to enact them. So to go back to this question of Lahore's future, or Delhi's future for that matter, the question becomes, can I imagine if this book is in the hands of someone who lives in Lahore 100 years from now? And no, I categorically cannot imagine it, because I cannot imagine someone being in Lahore 100 years from now. Again, because of environmental reasons. Even if you're super rich and you're able to get whatever, masks and oxygen supplies and air conditioners and bunkers and whatever, at that point, you're either going to be a migrant by choice, as in you're rich enough to buy a place in Dubai or wherever, or you're going to be a migrant by default, as in you cannot live and you must go or you must perish. And I think that threat of Lahore's, and again, Lahore is not alone in this. As I said, this is a kind of a North Indian and coastal threat, from rising seawater to melting glaciers. Many, many, many people, many, many, many cities are in the same exact conundrum right now, like this year, 2025.
Manan, in your introduction, you write that you can rest assured that by the end of this book, you will have experienced Lahore, and you've most certainly delivered on that promise.
Thank you.
Thank you for the insightful conversation and for taking the time to speak with us today. It was a pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you so much, Shwetha. I was really honored. Thank you for having this platform for us, and thank you for reading the book.
Thank you for listening to the Southasia Review of Books podcast from Himal Southasian. This episode was edited by Ritika Chauhan. If you like this episode, please share widely, rate, review, subscribe, and download the show on your favorite podcast apps. You can find the links to subscribe and listen to previous episodes on our website at himalmag.com. And while you're at it, please do also check out Himal's State of South Asia podcast hosted by Associate Editor Nayantara Narayanan, featuring conversations on pressing social and political issues from across South Asia. What we do and what we love doing at Himal is really looking at South Asian literature like no other. And that gives us a very unique community, viewpoint, and the privilege of making conversations like this possible. So if you'd like to help us out, please do become a paying Himal patron. We have a great program with lots of perks, including Himal's iconic right side up map. And we'll welcome you to a fantastic South Asia Review of Books community. Thanks again, and until next time.